I am Jacob Hornberger, president of the Future of Freedom Foundation, and welcome to this week's Trump Watch. The situation in Venezuela is so bizarre that it defies credulity. I mean, I feel like I'm living in this surreal world. When I was a kid, I was a big fan of Superman comic books, DC comic books, and I remember that there was a series that focused on what was called Bizarroland, where there were all these weird figures depicting Superman and other figures, Lois Lane, but they were all these bizarre figures that were drawn in a very strange way. And the thing about Bizarroland was that everybody did things that were bizarre, but everybody just considered them normal. And that's the way I feel about this Venezuela situation. I feel like I'm living in Bizarroland. And everybody, at least everybody in the mainstream press, just is operating on this assumption that everything's just normal here, that this is just no big deal. It's one of the most bizarre things I've ever seen. Let's review the history in a sort of summary way here. So Venezuela used to be a very prosperous country. Then they got taken over by the socialist regime, Hugo Chavez, and then he dies, and Nicolas Maduro takes over. And they transformed Venezuela into a socialist economic system. Now, it was obviously never pure free market or completely pro-capitalist, but it was sort of like free market oriented before the socialists came in. And so there was a relatively high amount of economic prosperity. The socialists come in, and not surprisingly, everything starts to crater. Same thing like in Cuba. You've got all this wealth, and it looks really attractive to the socialists, like, oh, wow, this is a way to solve poverty. We'll just take from the rich and give it to the poor. But what ends up happening is your economy starts cratering, in which case everybody ends up equally poor. And that's what was happening with this Chavista regime. But at the same time, the U.S. government could not stand the fact that this was a regime that, like Cuba, was independent of U.S. control. That is, they did not kowtow to U.S. orders. They would not take orders from the empire. And so this angered the U.S. national security establishment, the Pentagon, the CIA, and the NSA, just like with Cuba. Cuba was very similar, socialist regime, communist regime that would not take orders from the U.S. empire. And man, that put Cuba under extreme sanctions and embargo and so forth, designed to get rid of that regime and install a pro-U.S. regime, much like the Batista regime that preceded the Castro regime. So the sanctions are one of the policy tools that the U.S. government uses. It would be difficult, in my opinion, to find a more morally repugnant set of policy tools and sanctions. They're just horrific because they're guided by the same mentality that guides terrorism. They target the civilian population as a way to achieve a policy change or a regime change within the administration. How can anything be more immoral than that? To target people with death, because that's what they're trying to do with sanctions. They're trying to target them with economic privation and ultimately chaos, and economic crisis, and death by starvation or death by illness as a way to encourage the people to rise up and revolt against their tyrannical regime. It's sort of regime change on the cheap, where you don't have to sacrifice American soldiers in an invasion or occupation. You can use the citizenry of that country to do that. And of course, they always know there's going to be tremendous sacrifice, because every brutal tyrannical regime is going to do whatever is necessary to put down protesters, including killing them. But that doesn't matter. No price is too high to pay in terms of civilian dead in that country. And so that was the idea behind the sanctions. And when combined with Venezuelan socialism, it was a vice. that just squeezed the lifeblood out of the Venezuelan people, out of the economy. And so people were threatened with death by starvation because of the socialism and the sanctions. And this was the goal of the U.S. But rather than rise up in revolt against this tyrannical regime, which had all the guns, because Venezuela's system is the same as our system. They're a national security state. So they have this huge national security establishment. The Pentagon, the CIA, and the NSA, they have their version there. And the citizenry didn't have a way to revolt. They have gun control in that society. They have no way to revolt. So 8 million Venezuelans fled the country in an effort to survive. Men were trying to save their wives and their children and getting them out of the country, and old people, children. It was one of the biggest exoduses in our lifetime. People trying to save their lives, and many of them came to the United States, as we all know. But here, they were treated with extreme brutality, with disdain, with condemnation. Oh, they were called invaders and condemned for being bad people and having tattoos and gang members and all this. These were people that were fleeing the very policy that the U.S. government had put on them. But the government didn't want them to flee. The government wanted them to stay in Venezuela and give up their lives in a revolution. Much as like what's happened in Iran today. Same thing in Iran. Sanctioned Iran for decades with the idea of creating economic privation, chaos, crisis, death, until people rise up. And then we can see what happened there. People are disarmed, gun control in Iran, and they've been massacred. Now the protest is as dead as the protesters are. And so the Venezuelans, though, they fled. Now, imagine just for a moment what would happen if every country refused to take these Venezuelan immigrants. Suppose every country in the world took the same position as the U.S. government. You cannot enter our country. Well, then where would they go? Okay, they couldn't flee. The only reason they fled was because their hopes that some countries would accept them. And Colombia has really been amazing. They've I don't know exactly how many they've accepted, but I think they've clearly accepted most of them. I don't know, 2 or 3 million or so. But this is, of course, what happened in the 1930s when Hitler was willing to let go of the Jews, release them, let them leave Germany in the 1930s. No country would take them, including the United States. I mean, we often think that only Germany was anti-Semitic. No, the anti-Semitism was all over the world, including right here in the United States. And so President Roosevelt said, nope, we can't take them. We got a quota on German immigrants. We've already filled the quota. And so they had to stay there in Germany because no nation would accept them. And so when these Venezuelan immigrants got here to the United States, the attitude was, these are bad people. They're no good. They're scum. Return them by force to Venezuela. And when Venezuela, under the Maduro regime, refused to accept them, they started sending them to El Salvador. I mean, these are people who have fled U.S. sanctions, which I consider absolutely, totally evil. And they're sent to El Salvador for incarceration because they fled U.S. sanctions, where they're tortured and abused, and conceivably they were going to be held the rest of their lives. Now, they ultimately struck a deal with Venezuela that got them released, but that didn't have to happen. If that deal wasn't made, they'd still be sitting there if they weren't killed inside the penitentiary. So. But the whole idea was that this is a bad regime. Okay, now add to this that it wasn't just socialism that was bad about Venezuela, is that they were accused of being a narco regime. Now that's the reason that President Trump used to start using his military forces, where he started amassing this military armada in the Caribbean there that starts killing people in boats. And without any kind of formal indictment against these people. He accused them of violating drug laws, but there's no indictment against them. There's no formal charges against them. Under our system of government, when somebody violates a criminal statute, you go get an indictment. There were no indictments issued against any of these people in these boats. They just killed them. And even if there had been an indictment under our system of government, you can't just go out and kill people that have been accused by a grand jury of violating a drug law. I mean, this is how far this country has abandoned the principles on which this country was founded, including the principles right there in that Declaration of Independence and in the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, that you don't kill people without due process of law. All that's just out the window now with the conversion of the U.S. to a national security state. So they were just killing these people, but under the guise of the drug war, because they were saying that Venezuela was a narco regime. It wasn't just Maduro. The regime was a drug dealing regime. Another guy that was indicted along with Maduro by a grand jury in New York was Diosdado Cabello. He's the Minister of Interior, still is. Brutal guy, rounding people up, torturing them. I mean, this is why people are not protesting in Venezuela, is because of this guy. He has full command over the paramilitary forces there that will grab anybody off the streets, kidnap them, take them away. No different from what ICE does. They do it right there in Venezuela too. Well, then they go in and, well, let me step back a minute. There's an election, national election in Venezuela, I don't know, about a couple years ago or so, where the guy that went, the guy that the opposition put up, they were going to put up this woman, Maria Corina Machado. But Maduro came up with some ridiculous excuse as to why she was disqualified. So they disqualified her. And of course, it was a sham. He knew he would lose to her. So they put up another guy, I forget his name now, but he was really just a stand-in for her and for this opposition movement. And it's clear, I mean, no one really can dispute the fact that the opposition won this election. They went and kept the tallies at most of these voting stations, not the ones that Maduro controlled, but the ones he controlled. He wouldn't release them. But the ones that they got, which I think were about like 80% of the voting stations, this guy, the opposition won by about like 80% or something like that. But Maduro says, no, I won. And his election commission won. And he effectively stole the election. But you see, nobody could do anything about it. And you think that would hit home with Trump, because Trump was claiming that they stole the election from him in 2020. But this guy, Maduro, says they stole there's no question that Maduro stole the election here, but he had the national security establishment, which should show Americans why our founding fathers opposed, one of the reasons they opposed, national security states and vast military intelligence establishments like we have and like exists in Venezuela. Because if a president decides to stay in office, there's not anything anybody can do about it. You can rise up and start shooting and killing, but you're talking about a massive death toll on both sides. And so when people started protesting the opposition movement, these election results, Maduro just had his national security state, this guy, Diosdado Cabello, the Minister of the Interior, start rounding people up, taking them to the prison there and torturing them. So those protests died down. But Machado was clearly the leader, the real leader, even though she wasn't the presidential candidate. She was clearly the leader of this movement and would easily have won the election. So here Trump comes in and he's saying, Trump, in the prelude to the kidnapping of Maduro, he's saying this is an illegitimate regime. He's pointing out what everybody's been saying. Machado says it's an illegitimate regime. The opposition says because they didn't really win the election. They stole the election. That's an illegitimate regime. Not to mention the fact that it's socialist and so forth. But you could have a legitimately elected regime that's socialist. We have those in the United States, dating all the way back to Roosevelt, Lyndon Johnson, and Obama, and so forth. And the Republicans, too. They favor much of American socialism as well. Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, public schooling, Federal Reserve, etc. So here, the Trump administration is saying this is an illegitimate regime, rightly so. This is a narco regime. Well, now we're going back to the drug war. You see, the drug war that the U.S. government has been waging for decades, all my life. I mean, 70, 80 years? And it's all just a sham. Because they never win it. All they do is just continue running the same old game year after year after year. I mean, I grew up on the Texas-Mexican border. I practiced law down there, and I saw all this anti-war stuff, anti-drug war stuff, the DEA coming in. There's a police state along the border with DEA and ICE and Border Patrol and so forth. But it's just a racket. It's just a racket to control people. Because notice that the drug war has never won. See, they keep busting drug lords and having record drug busts and stuff, but it's never won because this is their method of control. And so that regularly they have new methods of control, like asset forfeiture, mandatory minimum sentences, we're going to win the war on drugs. We're going to win the war on drugs. And every federal judge today recites the same ridiculous garbage that the federal judges back in the 70s were spewing out about, I'm going to give you a maximum sentence. You're corrupting America with your drugs and so forth. It's just a great big racket. As we have long maintained here at FFF, you want to get rid of these drug cartels and these drug lords and stuff, the only way to do that is through drug legalization. But the problem is, at the same time as getting rid of the drug cartels through a legitimate free market, you also get rid of the drug war bureaucracy, which the drug war bureaucracy will not tolerate. It's a method of control. So they're using the drug war to go after the Maduro regime. All right, so they go in and they're saying it's illegitimate, and and U.S. officials are saying Machado's movement is the legitimate movement. They should be in power. So when Trump is amassing this armada, the opponents are no doubt very excited, BC, because they haven't been successful in ousting Maduro. The protests have not worked. They've been put down. And so really what should happen is, well, that's the problem with the Venezuelan people. You guys got to figure it out yourselves on how to do this. But instead, Trump comes in as a purported savior with this massive armada. And undoubtedly, many of them, the Venezuelan opponents, were saying, yeah, this is great. This is great. And Machado, for her part, she doesn't say anything. But it comes across as the fact that she's loving this, that she's catering to Trump. She certainly is not opposing what he's doing. What she should have done was says, look, Trump, the Maduro regime is illegitimate, but out of Venezuela. You have no business getting involved in our country. We will handle this ourselves. She didn't do that. In fact, she supported the sanctions. And she came across as implicitly, through silence, supporting this violent regime change operation that everybody thought was going to happen through an invasion and occupation and so forth. And she was ready. She says, I'm ready to take power and so forth, even though she had not been elected to anything. So in the meantime, she gets awarded the Nobel Prize for peace, even though she supports sanctions, which is no question based on violence. I mean, you to enforce sanctions, you have to initiate force against people, including the seizures of ships on the high seas and so forth. You're trying to inflict death on people. That's not exactly a peaceful enterprise. But she gets awarded this thing, and from all appearances, it looks like Trump is chagrined that he didn't get the Nobel Prize instead. Well, Trump ends up in an action that I think surprises everybody. A military operation that goes in there and just captures Maduro. Okay, no regime change because the regime is still there. They've removed the head of the regime, but remember, they've always said this is a narco regime. It wasn't just a narco guy that happened to be head of the regime. or a defense minister that happened to be in a non-narco regime. They were saying the regime was illegitimate. The regime was a narco regime. So what happens? They got Maduro up there in New York now to stand trials sometime in the future. I mean, they've already won with respect to him, because even if he's acquitted, it won't be for a year. They're already saying there won't be a trial for over a year. Whatever happened to the speedy trial requirement in the Constitution? But in any event, Trump has announced that he's going to have the regime remain in power. With the vice president, who wasn't elected, Delcy Rodriguez, who's just as brutal as the rest of them, and just as socialist as the rest of them, and just as illegitimate, if not more illegitimate. She wasn't elected of anything. She was appointed by Maduro. So Trump disses Machado and essentially the whole opposition movement. He says Machado doesn't have the respect of the Venezuelan people. Is he kidding? I mean, how can he say that with a straight face? Her movement won like 80% of the vote, but he's not talking about that election anymore, that stolen election. He's saying, well, I can work with Rodriguez, and he seems to like hold her in high esteem. She is part of this narco regime. When I say bizarro, I mean bizarro. And this guy, Diosdado Cabello, he's still there too. Now, there's people in the mainstream press saying, well, maybe we should get rid of Diosdado. I mean, like, oh, we'll leave the regime in, but here's a way we can reform it by getting rid of this brute and replace him with who? Another one. And Machado, for her part, I mean, her actions are as bizarre as anything. She should, at this point, be really upset with Trump because he's left this illegitimate regime in power indefinitely. We don't know when there's going to be elections, but we already know there's been an election. So, but they're not honoring that election by ousting these people or pressuring them to get out, because Trump is enforcing his orders with this oil embargo that he's got, which is comparable to the siege strategy that the Romans used to use, where they surround a recalcitrant enemy in a castle and just starve them into submission. And so he says, well, Rodriguez is doing as I say. We're getting oil out of there. We're going to make this a real oil prosperous deal. So he's essentially having them sell their oil to him or to the U.S. government and him as president. And he's going to decide where the money's going to go. And he says she's cooperating very nicely. And Machado, for her part, criticizes Rodriguez, and not surprisingly, saying, "Oh, she's just obeying orders of Trump." Well, duh. Of course, she's obeying orders of Trump. The alternative is mass chaos, because Trump has said he's going to cut off all revenue to Venezuela, which is through the oil. Well, he says he's going to cut off the oil if they don't do what he says, which is essentially cutting off all revenue to him. She has no choice. I mean, she could say, well, I'm going to stand fast. I'm not going to do what you're telling me to do. But I don't think there's any doubt that she is not doing this willingly. She's doing it because of the alternative is worse. Mass starvation across the country, including the national security establishment there that she's depending on for security. But notice something important. There are no protests in Venezuela from the opposition. Those protests are still dead because that regime is still in power. And now it's a U.S.-supported regime. They know that. Now, you think the opposition, whose family members and stuff are in these penitentiaries, who know they better not protest, are happy with this state of affairs? I mean, here we are in Bizarroland. We've got Venezuelan immigrants around the world celebrating. Oh my gosh, they got Maduro. There are no celebrations in Venezuela because the U.S. says we're going to support the continuation of this regime. So Machado, for her part, and Machado's supporters have been, well, you would expect them to say, this is not what we wanted. We don't want the continuation of that regime. right? But no, she is over there behaving in a very sycophantic way with Trump. She says, "Oh, he's a great man." And oh, this is the first step. Thank you for doing the first step to bring freedom to Venezuela. Are you kidding me? Freedom by continuing this narco regime, this illegitimate regime? She should be either saying that, why didn't you do the regime change that I was maybe secretly hoping you would do? Or she should be saying, you shouldn't be supporting this regime. Get out of there. Stop supporting it at all. Get rid of the sanctions. Let's just leave Venezuela to the Venezuelans. No. That what she does instead is she comes to Washington and says, I want to meet with President Trump because he's such a great man. And I mean, it's embarrassing. And her supporters, including libertarian supporters, are very quiet too. One gets the impression that they might have been secretly hoping for a regime change, but not come out and openly back it because it would look very seemly in the libertarian movement. But now you would think they would be criticizing Trump for supporting this socialist illegitimate regime. Very quiet, at least most of them are, from what I can see. I don't see them taking a big public stand against Trump because Machado isn't. She's over there meeting in the White House, and then, of all the weird things, she offers to give Trump her Nobel Prize. I mean, this is a big honor, Nobel Prize for Peace. I mean, this is something she should treasure. And she says, no, I'm going to offer it to Trump. For what? For tribute? That she's trying to ingratiate herself with him in case he changes his mind and puts her into office later on? I mean, it was weird. And Trump, for his part, should have said, hey, look, lady, I appreciate the offer. I know what you're doing. You're trying to be, suck up to me and stuff, but I can't take your Nobel Prize. I didn't win the Nobel Prize, and I felt like I should have won it, but I didn't. But this is yours. I'm not going to take your Nobel Prize. No, he accepts it. I don't know what he's going to do with it. I mean, he can't tell people, oh, well, I've been awarded the Nobel Prize, because he hasn't. He's just gotten the medal after the fact. And of course, the Nobel Prize committee said it can't be transferred. But he ends up with her Nobel Prize. So here we are in this weird dynamic where you've got massive violations of civil liberties at the hands of this brutal regime that is now a U.S.-supported regime. You've got the U.S. government supporting a regime that is totally socialist, which in mindset is no different from the Cuban regime. I mean, they believe in socialism and communism as much as, in fact, Machado called Rodriguez a communist. Okay, and so the U.S. is supporting this and extracting oil under this weird arrangement that they're doing, and still have the sanctions in place. You've got the leader of the opposition movement not daring to publicly oppose what's going on here, and instead behaving in a very suck-up, sycophantic way. I mean, when Trump said that Machado didn't have the respect of the Venezuelan people, I think that was totally incorrect. Until now, I don't see. If she hasn't lost a lot of respect among the Venezuelan people, I'd be very shocked. I mean, how could you have respect for this kind of conduct? In my opinion, your real hero that's going to come out of this is the Venezuelan person that says, we oppose this illegitimate regime. We want it out of there. And we also oppose U.S. interventionism in our country. Butt out, get out. You have no business here. That's your new Simon Bolivar that could arise out of this chaos. Where will this all lead? I don't know. But my hunch is that this is so bizarre. This whole situation is so bizarre, so surreal, that it wouldn't surprise me at all. There's an explosion in some way or another down the line, whether it's with Rodriguez cooperating with Trump. Oh, the CIA director goes down there and meets with this new interim president of the country, Rodriguez. What's the CIA director down there. I mean, it's what I've been saying a long time. Those of you that are familiar with my work, I've said that the national security establishment really is in control of the federal government, and they let these other parts of the federal government have the veneer of power, like Trump and the judiciary and so forth. But that's where the real power lies. And here is the director of the CIA meeting with the new interim president that up until a couple of months ago was part of the narco regime that justified all these killings and this military incursion involving kidnapping of Maduro, a regime that was called illegitimate because it lost the election. Now you've got the CIA director meeting with what was discussed? Why is the CIA involved in this? Isn't this something that like the State Department's supposed to be handling? But it shows it's like, the secrecy part of this whole Wizard of Oz thing where the national security establishment stays in the background suddenly surfaces. And it's a message not just to people in Venezuela, it's a message to the United States, to the American people as well. So what are the consequences within the Venezuela national security establishment to having the CIA meet with Rodriguez? Again, these are the bizarre dynamics that, a lot of times in these kind of operations, you don't see the results right away. Sometimes even a few years before something explodes, like in Guatemala, where they had that civil war after the regime change operation in 1954 that lasted 10 years or more and killed 1 million people or so. Or like the revolution in Iran in 1979, that was a blowback for what the CIA had done in 1953 to get a regime change operation. But my hunch is that this one is going, it wasn't a full regime change operation, but I got a hunch that there's something really bizarre that's going to come out from all this. I don't think it's going to be normal. That's Trump Watch for this week. Thank you all for tuning in, and thanks again for your support of FFF. Talk to you next time.